Right. So, in this episode, I want to talk about uh, doing a full day retreat for writing for the PhD, and this is very helpful from the standpoint of being able to clear all of the tickets that I had with ideas that had to go in, for my analysis. And if you're wondering, I do use a ticketing system. Otherwise, they just drop off because insight strikes in weird places, weird times, and if I don't capture it as a note that turns into a memo later and that goes into the draft after, I'd never be able to finish as someone that's doing this part-time. So I had a backlog and cleared all of the backlog. My first thought after doing it, as I was going to the gym and felt as empty as I'd ever been, both a good and a bad way, was that I'm kind of letting go of some of the ideas I might have even entertained about how immaterial minds could be, because that relief felt like weight off my shoulders, very physically. So very clearly, it's somewhere there, right? Unresolved problems carry a load in the mind. I can make that claim from the first person perspective. I think that's how it felt. Well, I'm saying it was negative. There was definitely a sense of no meaning to it after, or more, I should say, the usual feeling that I've had before from doing practical research, that after you analyze and you label data, you categorize it in some ways, you realize it's not as mystical. So mysticism of uncategorized data, I guess, feels to me exciting, but it's probably something that's just exciting in the mind, right? One could argue that. For others, it might be anxiety if they haven't learned to enjoy that process. You can easily see people that try to fit the world into their preconceived categories and struggling with new information. That's probably in some ways related to personality types. I've done the big 5 personality traits, and I'm in like the 97th percentile on openness to experience. So, comes with positives and negatives, because one could easily see it in the feedback I get for my PhD of not like turning it into just a full-on curiosity project. So that's why I'm recording, the podcast very often, so that some of the side ideas I get, I want to put them out and also, very honestly, claim some territory. I'm not sure everyone that's near the fields that I'm interested in has had all of those ideas, right? So why wouldn't I try to say I came up with it my way? I think I've talked about this before. So the interesting thing after a day of writing, and I had been preparing, looking back through my literature review, and adding the latest, where I'm up to, being clear about my, the philosophical landscape I'm looking at, and then what I'm picking from that landscape, then the methodology, and then I started writing a second draft of some findings, because I did have some write-up from the pilot study I did with 5 people, so having all of the data from notes, I thought, instead of waiting for all of the analysis to be done bottom-up, I have not committed to the bottom-up coding anyway in the methodology, because it's not the appropriate level to be analyzing for broad themes like rationality and intuition that I'm interested in. So I realized I need to look back a bit more top-down, so that I can balance the really bottom-up coding I've been doing on perceptions of places and thinking of the detail with the top-down and a general rules of thumb that people talked about. So again, for anyone that hasn't listened to some of the bits I've talked about with the PhD, I'm interested in how academic students and staff from Manchester Metropolitan University are kind of choosing where to live, specifically with the focus on broad themes of, do they make the decisions rationally? What kind of perceptions do they have? How does perception of place play a role in that? But, this is secondary because this is a project that's being done by someone else, Sean Brophy. He's finished his PhD. I'm actually reading this. So making sure that his somewhat quantitative and a bit of qualitative work fits in with mine. So I'm trying now in this draft to see, to be brave in writing, because analysis leads to paralysis very often. So I'm trying to also keep myself calm about this, right? I'm going to have multiple drafts, and I'm going to make some overclaims, underclaims based on the data I've got, and it's just part of the natural process. Again, it's not, I'm saying I'm not going to do scientific work that's going to be true to the data. It's just I need to be free to write, because the self-censoring of trying to get it right the first time is the death of all creativity. And I do think there is something to be said here about my interest in intuition and how that's different from creativity, because intuitions can be more wrong, gut feelings, whereas creativity is probably akin to when intuitions go well only. But that distinction is very novel in my mind. It's not what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about is noticing how, when I looked at, so I have this question after I go with my participants through, where they're from, a bit of their background, because I'm interested in their education, attainment, and occupation. Then talking about their place identity, where they feel they're from, and attachment, specifically using environmental psychology work, and looking at kind of the three levels of being attached to family, to friends, people, and then being attached to the physical surroundings in a place. That's work from Hidalgo and Hernandez, 2001, environmental psychology. Then I asked them about their goals and priorities, to see how, for each of the situations where they had to change where they lived. And then after that, I asked them, well, do you think you made the decision to move from X to Y rationally? And I go back to each of the places they had mentioned they had moved to, they've lived in. So based on their own goals, and then comparing that to whether they think they made a rational decision, I'm going to be talking about broad themes of bias from the first person perspective. So one could argue that, so I think the first tier would be, just discussing what appears in people's minds when they talk about places. So that's kind of the perceptual bit, because they would talk about places and highlight different aspects of where they've lived, right? And then the next tier is trying to talk about, okay, so if we know from behavioral economics they've got bounded rationality, how does bounded rationality work? Where are they biased? But I don't want to say bias compared to this ideal of rationality, but rationality is defined by their own goals. So I've got the data of what their own goals are. If they actually made the decision not according to their own goals, one could talk about bias. And then digging deeper, maybe biases are just a window to the workings of some or another rule of thumb. But I've got also questions about how these rules of thumb could be transmitted. So heuristics are detailed protocols. not the heuristics themselves. So there's something in the mind that's like a cognitive shortcut that people use, right? But that's difficult to observe. You have to ask people and then try to get them to verbalize is always difficult. So I've used a technique called cognitive task analysis, kind of. So it's you basically go back to each of the situations multiple times in detail, so that when they say just don't make a decision when you're in turmoil, because that was a key situation with one of my participants where they were moving away from New York because that was attacked 9/11, and in an instant they knew they had to move away for safety reasons, but they needed to follow another process of thinking it through. They actually used a spiritual practice to do that, but it is still more of a cognitive engagement than just a quick appraisal that they followed. So you then have the steps, and formalizing those steps can be helpful to then communicate to other people that might find themselves in a similar situation. So I've got all of these rules of thumb at the top line. I haven't done the deep analysis of the steps and transforming those into protocols and comparing them to other meta heuristics from the literature. But I noticed that there is somewhat of a hierarchy between people talking about more basic concerns with their heuristics and probably more higher order ones. So at the highest ends, there is the spiritual ones and totally subjective ones. So people talking about, you should make your own decisions, and then talking about exactly how that differs from having to justify yourself to others. And then at the other extreme, you have just stuff like check the crime rates before you move in a neighborhood, right? So at these two extremes, it's clear. And then in the middle, one could see how the others were slotting. So I could just think through, if I'm analyzing in this broad sense rather than too deep, a humanistic psychology approach, at least to the thematic ordering of this, could be helpful. So I've been looking at the literature from humanistic psychology, and I've in my philosophy talked about humanistic geography quite a bit. So it does follow with the commitments I've made methodologically and philosophically, that I look at the broad themes outlined early on by Abraham Maslow, but more recently by other humanistic psychologists like Kaufman, where one can imagine a hierarchy of place needs, and then obviously the more popular framing of that is into a pyramid, but apparently Maslow never drew a pyramid. I'm going to have to trust Kaufman about that. I don't have the time or capacity to dig deeper into Maslow's work at this stage. I'll do it later. But well, am I going to do it later? No, I have to trust other scientists. But the point here is that the basic and higher order needs fit into more of an analogy of a sailboat, where you have the hull of the boat and then the sail of the boat, and both are important, because even people doing management level and psychology from Maslow would know that you don't just build up to the next level until you become self-actualized. But I've been thinking how this approach to the hierarchy of place heuristics could be helpful in merging place branding, which often represents images of just thinking about the higher order needs and not forgetting the more basic needs of safety, belonging, and self-esteem of people, which are always the priority of place management, but sometimes not communicated well as a strategy in place branding. So I did wonder if I could think of this for now as a form of place self-actualization. Sorry, because let me phrase this well. from geography, we know that how people talk about place, it very often reflects a lot about how they see themselves. So the place and self combo is always difficult to untangle. And while methodologically, for if you're trying to be analytical about it, this is a problem. If you look at it humanistically and thematically, it's helpful, because at the end of the day, the application in practice is at that level. So thinking about place actualization could be helpful. So I really do think, obviously it's going to have to be place actualizing as a process. And what do we lose if we use this language as opposed to the market logic that we're trying to adjust? So I've started from the market logic, trying to do place branding, quote unquote, or looking at behavioral economics, quote unquote, to investigate something that's not a product, it's not an economic thing, it's place. So maybe we let go of the scaffolding, and I'll acknowledge that in my writing, but we go to the humanistic perspective of place actualizing, because then we can, once we are firm about this, because I don't have a horse in the race of just trying to use the language of one discipline or another, because I'm not a straight up academic and I don't have allegiances. I just want to describe the phenomenon as best as possible. But then could this be freeing for people that have to do this job, where they go, oh, okay, right, so are you telling me that if I need to think about the actualization of the place I'm responsible for the place actualization, so that process, how would that look? Would I have to do would I have to care about safety or connection or self-esteem as the basic needs, or would I have to care about exploration, love, and purpose as the more higher order needs? We have to take care of all of them, because we know place is a complex thing where many people are living, and many of them have developed themselves differently on the different levels of the hierarchy. So I do think it could be a workable thing, and if it's defended well, it could help. I'm thinking specifically in the UK context, where I know business improvement districts always get justified on the basis of economics, when really most of what they do is not economic. It's trying to deal with things like safety, just basic safety and cleanliness. They try to do community events where people can feel more connected. They try to give the local businesses a platform to show themselves compared to multinationals, and have self-esteem about being independent. So they deal with the basics, the basic needs. Again, nothing wrong about them. The basic is probably not the right word, but please, you understand what I'm saying. And then they also do have to find new ways of dealing with novel problems. So and encourage the people that are there to find new avenues. So when there is new businesses and new exploration and innovation is necessary, they also are always in charge of creating place marketing that tries to get people to love the place. And they also have to show a vision or a purpose, and that purpose needs to be bought in by the variety of stakeholders. So they do have not just the basic, but the higher order needs of people in. So I'm not going to continue being defensive about finding more than economics and more than marketing in this, because economics and marketing help us understand certain aspects, but they don't deal with the whole thing. And if you want to deal with the whole thing, you got to take a more humanistic approach. So that's it. Place actualizing, I think, might have a future. Oh yeah, and before I forget, I'm also gonna post here me trying to do a recording, being really confused and really tired, just so you can see the workings of a mind when it doesn't work, when I'm too tired. But feel free to skip it. I don't think there's anything of value there, because I've even like crossed it off of my mind. But I think it's important to post these things so nobody has an illusion that papers and academic work is perfect from the first time. It requires a lot of thinking and a lot of throwing away of work that is not right, and accepting the fallibility of our minds. So I'm still gonna post it after here. It's like an 8-minute segment. Not even gonna think about it because I'm just gonna get embarrassed, but I'm gonna post it here. Have a listen if you want to. Welcome to this episode. Now, I usually record when I'm in a good mood, and a big part of why I do this while I'm walking is, I get into gear, everything's moving and grooving, and then I try to talk positively about research, but I'm in a really bad mood because I've worked really hard. And given that science is supposed to not be about moods and feelings, right? It's important to acknowledge that these feelings and emotions, as someone that does that for a job, exist, and yet they can be separate from our pursuits for truth. And how we do this is by bracketing, right? Putting things to the side. And how does that look in reality? It's not that I have used some of the methods proposed by people that are like the grounded theorists of the world, Glaser and Strauss. They actually recommended, if you think you're biased, you just put your data together with participant data and you just analyze it together so that it just becomes part of the thing. Sometimes using stuff from behavioral economics about being in tilt helps. You shouldn't be making big decisions. And interestingly, in my PhD participant kind of views, some of the rules of thumb they recommended when they talked about choosing where to live. There was one specific one that talked about never making a decision while being in tilt. I think they called it. Yeah, that was the general gist. That's a good guide, but then as a practical day-to-day researcher, how can we put these to the side? It's very interesting. It's an interesting problem to have to face day in and day out. Because over the last week I got COVID for the second time. It was very mild and easy, but still it messed up my plans to go to a PhD writing retreat. I was not going to go face-to-face because they cancelled the face-to-face, but I booked myself to be in the Royal Geographical Society members area. I was going to look at some atlases and write, and that fell through. But I went through with the writing retreat, which was a whole day's worth of writing in different segments, and it was very good, very helpful to be able to clear all of the tickets from my research board. So I actually do chunk what I want to write into little cards, little tickets, using Trello. It's something I picked up from working in more of the digital world, where if you're going to be designing something, it can always creep up, and being able to chunk it in small things really helps. So yeah, I use that. And I was able to do everything that I had, and got to the point where I realized how meaningless my PhD research feels when I look at the whole thing. All right, it's very meaningful to me because I put effort in it, but now I've realized it's utterly meaningless in some ways, which is very healthy. It's if you don't get that feeling, I think you can keep turning the PhD into the transformation of your own learning process. I always had to learn how to do research, but now I can do good enough research to submit the PhD, and yeah, I'm gonna really now focus on writing a good summary of what the PhD process was about. I actually want people to understand it. I'll look for ways that I can apply it further. Obviously the methods and research training has been tremendous. It's just got me another career. I mean, the one I wanted. So that's helpful, and I think applying it, to help public services, I find that meaningful. It's very good. But the topic itself, I'm starting to think, how can it be helpful, especially now that I'm starting to write up the results, and I was able to find the PhD topic of I was actually I applied for a PhD that was already structured, and it was already had a topic, but I didn't get that. Someone else did, and they've already submitted their PhD. Big shout out, Sean Brophy, Manchester Metropolitan University. I'll have to cite his work because I'm doing a similar thing, but basically how I got my PhD funding was because I interviewed alright. I was told if I develop my own topic, then I'd be given the funding, and I've tried to keep it separate. With Sean, we've caught up every now and then throughout the process. So he uses a mixed methods approach to understanding the graduate mobility of people in Manchester, whereas I've gone fully qualitative, narrow and deep into understanding the kind of the more intuitive processes that people go through, what he seems to be terming subjectivities in his research. I'm still reading the thesis, and the question is now, how can we best apply this? Because between us, surely, in this, case of Manchester, have looked deep enough. So I'm trying to think, what's the focus within my data that's best to put into the final written thing, because it's rich qualitative data. And starting to write yesterday, it was very clear to me that I've got a lot on my hands when it comes to analysis, and I guess the key takeaway would be to just keep taking it one step at a time, because it does seem to emerge inductively, and I know that most people have another conception of stereotypical science, but if you're going to be studying the pull of people towards what am I trying to say? I'm totally stuck.